Today we will be solving quadratics by using square roots to solve for the x-intercept. So just a quick review of what we're doing when we're trying to solve a quadratic. Again, the directions will say to solve, and solve means that we want to find the x-intercepts. And so again, what the x-intercepts are, remember the graph was this U-shaped graph that we call a parabola. So if I just sketch a quick coordinate plane, this being my x-axis here, a parabola looks like a U-shaped graph, typically like this, or it could end up going upside down as well, like this. And what we look for are where the graph crosses the x-axis. So for instance, here we would have a point here and here, and these would be our two solutions. Over here we'd have these two as our solutions. So that's what we're finding when we're trying to solve a quadratic, and here we're using square roots. So let's see how it's done. Well, we can use square roots whenever we have an x squared term or a variable by itself. So to solve for it, all we have to do is take the square root. So over on this side, I'm going to take the square root of x squared, which is just x. Now I'm going to take the square root of 81. Now there are two numbers that you can get when you take the square root of 81. You see how we could either have 9 times 9. See, those two numbers multiply to make 81. And then we also have negative 9 times negative 9. Those two numbers multiply to make the same value of 81, as long as they're the same number. So what we have are two different answers. And what we say is plus 9 or negative 9 is one way to show this. So there it is. You could also write this as two separate numbers, 9 and negative 9. In either order is fine. You can even put braces around it to show that it's a solution set. So taking a look at this next one here, we've got it all solved for, so we're ready to go. So we just take the square root. So you're thinking of what two numbers multiply to make 100. That's the real problem here. The two numbers that make x squared are just x. And the numbers that make 100, well, remember there's two. There's 10 times 10, or we also have negative 10 times negative 10. Those are the two different values that both give us the same answer of 100. And so we would write our answer as plus or minus 10 would be our answer. So either positive 10 or negative 10. So again, when the variable squared is all by itself, you're ready to just solve. You can do that. And so when you take the square root, you think of what two numbers multiply to make 225. Well, when the number's odd, try odd numbers. When the number's even, try even numbers. You know 144 makes 12. Most people know that. So the number's got to be bigger than 12. And another rule I look at is if you look at the number 5 at the end, we want the number to end with the two values that multiply to make it to also end at a 5. So if you look at like 15 times 15, see 5 times 5 makes 25. So I know the number ends in a 5. So this would be a good guess to try. And sure enough, it does equal 225. But we also have to realize that negative 15 and negative 15 also multiply to make the same number. So that's why we have the two answers that are in there, negative 15 and 15. So again, what those represent are 2 points where this parabola ends up crossing the x-axis. This one looks a little different because x squared is on the other side, but no fear, all you do is the same thing. You just take the square root. Square root of x squared is just x. Now find those two numbers that make 441. Well, again, remembering that rule, when we have an odd number here, so when this is odd, you try odd numbers because it's going to be an odd number eventually. Try odds. And so we know that 20 times 20 is 400. So let's try 21 times 21. And 1 times 1 makes 1. And this number ends in a 1. And sure enough, that works. That makes 441. Negative 21 times negative 21 also makes the same answer. So that's why we say the answer is negative 21 or positive 21. And we can just write plus or minus 21. Well, we got a problem with this one. When we take the square root of x squared is x, but right here, because of this negative number here, we say that we don't have a solution. Can't take the square root of a negative. At least in this class we won't be doing that. And so what we'll say is that there's no solution. And the reason was because x squared equaled a negative number. When it equals a negative, that means there's no solution. So what no solution represents is this. In this case, we would have this coordinate plane. Hopefully you drew yours a little better than I did. Let me try that again here. A little straighter line. So what we have here is a parabola that ends up just never crossing the x-axis. It looks something like this, where it opens up. I know it'll open up, and it'll cross at positive 400 actually. And it'll cross the y-axis at positive 400, but it will never come down to the x-axis. So that's why we just say there's no solution or no x-intercepts. That's what we have there. Okay, so on this next one, first thing we're going to do, a little different, we got to get x squared by itself. So divide by 3. And so when we do that, I've got x squared equals, and then I do the division. I've got 3 goes into 108. Well, 3 goes into 10. We've got 3 times. And then I've got 1 left over, so that makes 18. So that makes 3 goes into 18 6 times. So 36. So from that point, all we're going to do is take the square root. Take the square root of both sides. You've got x left over, and x equals 6. But remember, it could be 2 numbers, either positive 6 or negative 6. And so that would be our answer. For the next problem, we are going to do the same sort of thing. We're going to end up having to divide by 4 on both sides. And when we do that, we're ending up with 25 equals x squared. And so from that point, all we're going to do is take the square root of both sides. So x ends up equaling plus or minus 5. Well, this next one, I'm going to end up subtracting 7 from both sides. And when I do that, I'm left with x squared, and then this all equals, well, 7 from 71. If you think of 11 minus 7 makes 4, and so we end up with 64. Well, when we go ahead and take the square root of both sides, we end up with 8. And so remember, there's going to end up being 2 answers here, either positive 8 or negative 8. So this next one, we have a little bit more work to do. So you got to end up subtracting. We've got a subtraction of 64, so we're going to do an opposite operation of adding 64 to both sides. So what I have now is this 49x squared equals 64. And so I'll go ahead and do some division there. I'm going to divide by 49. And when I do that, I end up with this. I have x squared equals 64 49ths. And so when I go ahead and take the square root of both sides, I end up having a fraction as an answer. But remember, there's 2 answers. Just take the square root of both numbers. Square root of 64 is 8. The square root of 49 is 7. But remember, there's 2 answers, either positive or negative 8/7. This next one looks like you might end up having no solution, but we got the negative number in front of the x squared as well. So divide by negative 2. Let's see what's left over. Over here, we're left with an x squared equals, and then 2 goes into 16, we have 8 times. 2 goes into 2 1 time. And so we end up having to take the square root of both sides. So we're left with an x equals plus or minus 9. And taking a look at the last one. So here we are going to end up having to move this 100 over first. And so I'll go ahead and take it away from both sides. And when we're left with this 9x squared, it equals negative 100. And we've got ourselves a problem. You might see it right now, or maybe you'll see it after I do the next step. See, when I divide by 9, 9 doesn't go in there, but that's not a big deal. We had that situation last time, actually 2 times ago, when we had number 9 here. 49 didn't go into 64, but we still took the square root of both sides. And so this next one, this part right here, we end up seeing that we have this negative sign in front of the fraction. And so the problem is that we have this negative sign out in front of the in front of the 100. And again, when you take the square root of both sides, you can't take the square root of a negative number because we can't find 2 numbers that multiply to make 109ths that are exactly the same. You see, if we use 10 over 9 times 10 over 9, that equals 100 over 9. But in order to make a negative 100 over 9, that means one of them would have to be negative to make that negative 109. Either one of them. But those are not the same number. See, these are not equal. And since they're not equal, that means we have no solution. So basically what this means when we say there's no solution is that we have no x-intercepts. The graph just doesn't cross the x-axis, and that's what we're trying to find here. And when we get this situation with the negative number equaling a square root or equaling an x squared value when we have a parabola that just does not cross the x-axis. So again, what this one would end up looking like is it would be a right side up parabola, very steep, and it would cross the y-axis at 100, and it would end up just opening up rather than down. So it would never cross that x-axis. So those are problems that you'll end up seeing on tonight's homework. Good luck.